Yes, thank you all very much for coming. It's a wonderful turnout, thank you. First of all, an apology. Over the last few weeks, I've gone completely deaf in my left ear. And one of the consequences of that is not only can I not hear on the left-hand side, but I'm told that when I talk, my voice drops and gets quite soft. So if you can't hear me, just stick your hand up and shout, "We can't hear you!" And secondly, the commercial. Tonight's talk is based on a book I did a few years ago called Megalithic Mysteries of Cornwall. Copies of this are available for anybody who would like to buy a copy. And just see Lana in the front row here in the purple afterwards. Right, let's to begin at the end. And the end is the end of the land. And this is one of the cliff castles that surround the peninsula of West Penwith. This one is Carn Le Bol, near Nanjitsu, not very far from Land's End. There are quite a number of cliff castles around. We think they were either lookout places or possibly places where people would meet traders and exchange the tin ore from Cornwall for incoming goods. The significance of this particular one, as some of you may well know, is where the energy lines enter or leave West Penwith. I think these lines are known by everybody, most people, as the Michael and Mary lines. These were the names given to them by Dowser Hamish Miller and the writer Paul Broadhurst. And the significance of them is that these energy lines travel across Cornwall, out of Cornwall, through into England, and right across the country, ending up in Norfolk. I say they're energy lines, but what do we mean by energy? Which is a sort of fundamental question that sometimes people don't really ask. There are lots of energies all around us. There are electromagnetic energies, there are energies, cosmic energies that come in from space, there are radiation energy that's given off by the rocks in the land. So what exactly do we mean when we say there are energy lines running across the land? Well, it's a fundamental question, and it's one that is not always very obvious. Now, amongst you may well be, I know there are, sitting here some dowsers, and they're able to find these energy lines, they're able to dowse them. And they report that there are more than just these two, Michael and Mary. There are hundreds upon hundreds of these energy lines running across the country. So, although some people might have some reservations about this, nevertheless, it can be shown to be a very real phenomena that people can pick up on. The dowsers say that they can use anything. It doesn't have to be a particular rods or hazel twigs or anything, because what they're picking up is a sensitivity to energies that are running across the land. There are not only energies, there are other things out there that can also be dowsed, such as water lines. And it's been found that many ancient sites are positioned, particularly stone circles, on the confluence of a number of water lines. But as far as the energy lines go, some people will say it's earth energy that they're picking up, although that raises further questions as what we actually mean by Earth energy. But nevertheless, it is a real and verifiable phenomenon. You can use the process of dowsing to find out things about ancient sites, to ask questions of the sites themselves. And it's interesting how this can be used in a very practical way. Now, for instance, I'm not a dowser, but my partner Lana is. And we have found quite a number of lost or hidden standing stones by the process of dowsing. I'll go and look at some of the ancient maps, the tide maps and things, and find either that there was a standing stone, perhaps in a field, or that there's a name of the field is indicative of the fact that it might have had a standing stone in it. A lot of the fields are called Tremenere or Tremenere, and that's Cornish for home of the standing stone. So we know that within a field there probably once was a standing stone. We'll then go to that field. Lana will do dowsing in a grid pattern up and down across the field and across and back, and she'll ask the question, where was the standing stone? And many times she'll get an answer, a very precise location for the standing stone. And then she'll maybe ask, where is the standing stone now? Show me the location. And again, up and down and along the hedges and so on. And in many cases, we've been given the answer, oh, the standing stone was here in the hedge. And the hedges are now, of course, very overgrown, like many Cornish hedges. But very often, what we've done is clear the hedge, scrape away the vegetation, and lo and behold, there is part, at least, of the standing stone that was originally in the field, built into the hedge. Now, this shows that dowsing can work because it can be used to locate very specific things. I recall once we went to a place outside Helston called Tremenere, which indicated there was a standing stone there originally. And Lana dowsed the field and found that there were 2 standing stones there, which we didn't know. There's no record of this. So we asked the farmer, who come along to see what we were doing, had there been a standing stone in the field before? Oh yes, he said, there were 2. He said they'd been removed, and in fact they built into a bungalow down Port Leven. So it's interesting that it shows that dowsing can be used for very specific things like that, and to actually find sites. So, from Carnaval, these 2 lines come in, these energy lines. Now people have a notion that energy lines and ley lines are the same thing. Well, they're really not, because it's been found that leys are an alignment of sites across the land. It was a term coined back in the 1920s. But a lot of these energy lines are not straight. They curve and they twist and they turn as they run across the land. And this is the case with these particular Michael and Mary lines. They come in at Carnaval, they can be dowsed there, and then they separate and move in different directions across the land, linking together ancient sites. If we follow the Mary line of the 2, they've been given these different names because the Michael lines often run across the high points, linking together sites which were dedicated to St. Michael. And the Mary line often runs through more lower line sites like Holy Wells, such as Ali, other places like this. So one is thought to be a very male-orientated type line, yang, and the other, the yin line, is the female line running through the land. And the one from Carnaval runs to another site, which will be very familiar to many people, is Boscanoon Stone Circle. And it's very interesting that when Hamish Miller was dowsing this particular line, he found it came in to the stone circle at Boscanoon at an angle of 13 degrees. It then went to the so-called centre stone, it's just slightly off-centre, and it changed direction quite dramatically and exited the circle at an angle of 53 degrees. And that is the angle of the standing stone itself. So people often wonder, was it originally upright? Has it always been at this angle? Well, certainly the dowsing would tell us that it's always been at that angle, and the actual angle of the standing stone is the angle at which the energy changes direction and moves off across the land. The centre stone is marked in an interesting way, because carved at the base of the stone there are carvings which originally Ian Cook suggested were carvings of axe heads, and more recently Tom Glosker has done psychogrammetry on it and suggested that they were carvings of feet. But whether they're axe heads or whether they're feet, the carvings at the bottom of that centre stone actually are illuminated by the rising sun at the midsummer solstice. So if you stand in a circle and see the sun rising over the horizon, it will strike the carvings at the bottom of the stone, illuminating them. I don't think this is coincidence. Clearly this stone was important. It was an important marker, directional stone, and it had significance in relationship to the rising of the sun at a key moment in the wheel of the year of the summer solstice. And we'll be looking at some other alignments of an interesting nature later on in the talk. The Mary line, as I say, strikes the carvings at the bottom of the centre stone, and then it carries on. It goes up at an angle of 53 degrees. It then goes through a triangular stone which is in the hedge on the trackway that leads down to Boscanoon Farm, and then it carries on across the land, going through other further sites. The two energy lines, the Michael line and this Mary line, meet again and cross over at St Michael's Mount, where they intersect with two other major energy lines, called the Athena line and the Apollo line. And all four lines meet at the very important and sacred site of St Michael's Mount. So there are interesting things that are going on in the land, and of this line, Hamish Miller once said, the impression was of a nerve ganglion, a crucial point of exchange and interaction in a nervous system that was alive and functioning, irrespective of whether Homo sapiens comprehended it or not. And I think that's a lovely summary of it, that these lines are there, they exist. It's a chicken and egg situation. Were the sites built because the energy lines were there, or did the building of the sites and their relationship to one another create the energy or enhance the energy between the lines? But all of this is attested. Lots of people have found these, lots of people have dowsed them. So they're a very real part of Earth's energy, though quite what their source is, quite where they come from, quite how they work, is still, the jury is out on it, I think. But if you're dowsers, you already know this. If you're not dowsers, there is a dowsing group, the Trencron Dowsers, down in the west of Cornwall, and the Tamar Valley Dowsers in the east of Cornwall. Both of them are very happy to have newcomers come along and try out their dowsing skills at the various sites they visit. Now, as well as these energy lines that we can find, we can dance, running across the land. There are also, as I mentioned earlier, the notion of lays, straight lines, alignments of sites. And interestingly, some of these sites we've been looking at also have a straight line alignment, a visual alignment across the land. This particular visual alignment starts at Carnaby that we've already looked at. It goes to Boscanoon, so circle, that we've already looked at. It goes on to the Blind Fiddler, standing stone, that we'll look at in a minute, and ends up at the Singy Round, which is a round, a hill fort, dating from the Iron Age period. Actually, a site that's owned by Caspon, Cornish Ancient Sites Protection Network, who try to look after some of these sites and do their best to protect them and stop them being vandalised or used for development or anything. Now, these direct lines running across the land, such as one to the Singy, goes on beyond the Singy, are what some people would call lays. They are a visual alignment of sites that may be coincidence or may not. There's certainly a lot of them, and a fine piece of online work was done by Paul Jenkins, and it's called Ancient Penwith. And if you go to ancientpenwith.org, you can see the maps of West Penwith and the rest of Cornwall with all the alignments marked on the maps of these ancient sites and how they link together across the land. There are hundreds of them. It's quite amazing. Now, some of them may be chance and coincidence, but it may well be that the people who actually built the sites located them precisely because they had a visual or other alignment with another site in the land. It was this notion of lays or alignment of sites which interested a bunch of people called the lay hunters, which is where I first became interested in this subject and became involved in it way back in the 1980s. And some of the proponents of the lay hunter theory, such as Paul Devereux and John Michel, did a lot of work on this way back in those days. People are now rediscovering some of this, like reinventing the wheel. But in some of Paul Devereux's books and John Michel's, like the Review over Atlantis, you'll find a lot of interesting information about the meaning and significance of sites like this being aligned across the land. And once we open our eyes to the land and we go and visit some of these sites, we can start to see for ourselves some of the things that the ancient builders of these sites may well have intended. For instance, looking at one of these lays, particularly a good one, discovered originally by John Michel. It runs from Tregasil Stone Circle, which is near St Just, and that's Tregasil with Carn Kennyjack in the background. It runs across the land in a straight line, linking together various sites. Now, the astronomer Norman Lockyer, at the beginning of the 20th century, made a lot of observations down here about suns and moons and stars in particular that could have been visible and seen from these sites at the time they were built. And in particular, this one, he noted that a very bright star, I think it's the fourth brightest star in the heavens, is called Arcturus, and even today it's a very bright star. I mean, we've just come back from our place in Crete, and we were sitting on the balcony at night looking up at some of these stars, and really, because there's no light pollution, really bright star Arcturus was, very visible even today, and it must have been so much more so when there was no light, street lighting or background lighting at all. From the time of the building of the Tregasil stone circle, which was at the end of the Neolithic, beginning of the Bronze Age, Arcturus would have appeared over the top of Carn Kenidjack. Now, Carn Kenidjack was already important to the prehistoric peoples. It was a possible touring closure. Craig Weatherall used to argue very much for its identification as a touring closure. Touring closures were some of the earliest sites that were built by the Neolithic people. The ones that are well known are at Carn Brae near Megalithic, Helm Tor, Carn Galba in West Benworth, and this one, Carn Kenidjack. They were places that were originally enclosed or fortified by the Neolithic people, and by the subsequent generations of the Bronze Age people, they were undoubtedly places that were honoured by them as places of the ancestors. Their ancestors built these places, therefore they were places of spirit. They were places perhaps where the gods and goddesses dwelt, or the spirit of the ancestors lived. So they continue to be revered, and one has to wonder whether the building of this stone circle, originally two stone circles, east and west, at Tregasil, were done in this particular location because of the rising of Arcturus over the top of the tall enclosure of Carn Kenidjack. It must have seemed the most magical sign to these people. It was almost like it was an indication of the spirit of the ancestors. And in many cultures we know there is a belief that after death the spirit from the human body travels to the nearest star. So it may well have been that the people who built Tregasil Circle thought that the spirit of their ancestors had, after their death, had gone to the star Arcturus, and it sat hovering over the place where they created the tall enclosure. I think once we begin to look at the ancient landscape in these kind of ways, we begin to see that they're not just places of antiquity where stones were built, but they were, to the people that built them, living places of spirit, places where they connect with their ancestors, with their gods, their goddesses, and directly the spirit of the ancestors themselves. So, from Tregasil Circle, if you stand outside the circle and look towards the eastern horizon, you will see just the tip of a standing stone called the Boston's Menhir. And it's very interesting when you look at the relationship of stones and stone circles across the landscape. It's very often just the tip that is visible from one side to the next, or if it's a flat piece of land, they only put up a small stone. They don't waste a lot of energy. They actually just have a marker to indicate where the next site is along this line, along this alignment. So Boston's Menhir stands proudly on the horizon, and again, looking at some of Lockyer's findings, it's interesting that at the end of the Bronze Age, so possibly 500, 800 years later than Arcturus appearing over Carn Kenidjack, when viewed from the Tregasil stone circle, across the top of this standing stone, Bosman's Menhir, they would have seen the rising of the Pleiades star system. Now again, the Pleiades star system, the Seven Sisters, is known throughout many, many cultures, prehistoric cultures, and it's in many of them, in their culture, the spirits of the people in the tribe after they die go to the Seven Sisters. So that's why I suggested that they may have thought the same for Arcturus over Conkenajak. So the appearance of the Pleiades over the top of Boswell's Menhir at the end of the Bronze Age again must have seemed really, really significant to them. We'll be coming back to the Seven Sisters, the Pleiades, a bit later on. From Boswell's Menhir, the line goes on directly to a fallen quoit called West Lanyon Quoit. This next slide shows myself and John Michel standing at West Lanyon Quoit. When John came down, we used to go out on these lay hunters expeditions, and he would plot this alignment or this lay across the land. We would walk it. He was no respecter of boundaries or fields or anything. He just strode across the land. I have a vivid memory of this one because he was standing on the hilltop behind from where he could see Boswell's in a direct line, and I was the other side of West Lanyon, following the trackway, the alignment along, and it came to a hedge, and he said, "Let's look in the hedge." So we scraped away the hedge, and actually built into the hedge was a standing stone, which must originally have been standing in the field marking the alignment. So these were exciting pioneering days when we discovered these things, and even though I'm getting a bit ancient nowadays, you can still get out there and find these things in the land. You can still follow these sites along the land. Go to Paulden's website, Ancient Penwith, and look at where the alignments run, and then get out in the land and follow them across the land, and it would be surprising what you just might find. And if you do, let me know. There's still so much to be found about these places. So this alignment goes through West Lanyon Quoit, and then it goes on to a courtyard house settlement. These courtyard house settlements were, gone too far. These courtyard house settlements were built in the Romano-Celtic period, consisting of courtyard houses unique to West Penwith. This is a slide of the Caspian in its early days doing the clearance at this particular courtyard house settlement. And the line continues further on across the land, linking together other sites as well. So even though we're, 4,000, 5,000 years later than some of these places that have been built, in a place like West Penwith you can still find these sites, and you still find places in the land that link together in a purposeful way. It's what brought John Michel down here in the first place, and his book, the Old Stones of the Land's End Peninsula, was a classic at its time, because he was the first one to actually look at these sites and see how they link together across the land. This work that's since been done and has been summarised in these maps on Ancient Penwith have shown up quite a number of interesting possibilities. There are a lot of lays at a lot of sites, and this particular standing stone, which is not that well known, is the Carfuri Menhir, and it's been plotted that the greatest number of lays or alignments in West Penwith actually go through this stone. It's quite a hidden stone, it's not easy to get to. But apparently it's been found by alignment studies that 8 different alignments running through West Benwith actually go through or focus on or interact with or intersect this particular standing stone. So it's things like this which I find really interesting. And I don't know why this stone should be more powerful, if you like, more energetic than any of the others. But, you know, visiting these places, if you're sensitive to the energies of these places, I think you'll pick up quite easily the places that are more buzzy, more energy focused, and also have possible significance in terms of the directions they point across the landscape. The next one is the Blind Fiddler, and the Blind Fiddler is a standing stone in a field next to the A30. It's a nice shaped stone, but you wouldn't think that it was of any particular significance. I mean, there's over 100 standing stones in the West Benwith Peninsula. But again, it's an example of things that you can find. One day we were walking across the pathway, across the field, nearby to St Burrion, and we came across this stone, which is quite a small marked stone, quite insignificant. It's never been recorded or registered or protected in any way, but it stands in the field. And when I was looking at this stone, I noticed that there was a direct visual alignment from this little marked stone to Sanctuary Beacon on the top of the hill there, and in between that marked stone and Sanctuary Beacon there is the Blind Fiddler. And you know, you think after a while, well, that little marked stone was put there for a reason. It was put there to mark the little alignment so that they'd be able to see the Blind Fiddler and the top of Sanctuary Beacon. Because very many of these stone circles and standing stones exist in relationship to the holy hilltops, like Sanctuary Beacon. Very often on these hilltops there are other monuments. On Sanctuary there remains of a Cisgrave on top of the hill. So to them the landscape was alive in ways that perhaps we don't quite comprehend nowadays. And that the fact that it was alive was marked by them with stones across the landscape to some of the holy hilltops. Another interesting example, again these are really lesser known sites. This one is the end of the Zenith Stone Row. Now, we don't have many stone rows in West Benwith. In fact, I think it's probably the only one. There are quite a few on Boblin Moor, so they obviously were used to building stone rows. And this one consists of 3 or 4 stones. It was identified by the archaeologist Peter Herring initially, and the end stone of this stone row is now reused as a gatepost, but it's clearly a standing stone. So the other side of the gatepost is just an ordinary middle of the road middling stone, but this one is a very fine standing stone. And as you walk across this stone row, down the stone row, towards this gatepost stone, the hill behind comes into view. Now that's Trendreen Hill, and by the time you actually reach the standing stone at the end of the stone row, the tip of the stone, the standing stone, is pointing absolutely beautifully at the tip of Trendreen Hill. Now, coming on to alignments in a moment, and most alignments happen around the solstices and the equinoxes, Very occasionally, we can make a case out for there being an alignment at the so-called cross-quarter days, which are the four Celtic pastoral festival days in between the solar ones. And this is one of them, because this stone pointing to the tip of Trendreen Hill, anybody standing there would have seen the sunrise at Samhain at the beginning of October, end of October, beginning of November, and at Imbolc at the beginning of February. Now that may or may not be a coincidence, but it's interesting nevertheless that where they placed this stone in the land was not at random, but actually reflected the shape of Trendreen Hill itself. And Trendreen Hill is another sacred hilltop with its own alignment that we'll be coming on to in shortly. So when we go out in the land and when we visit these sites, not only can we be more sensitive to the energies of these places, we can see how visually the ancient peoples may have constructed them and perhaps shaped them in order to reflect the shape or the existence of nearby sacred hilltops. Moving out of Penwith to Boblin Moor, this next one's a good example. It seems that the shape of this standing stone at Sibleyback on Boblin Moor has been deliberately shaped to reflect the shape of the neighbouring tor to which it actually points. So it's things like that when we visit the stones. I always think, wow, I visit the stone and then I look around and I think, well, what's in the neighbourhood? What are the hills, or where's the next site to this? Because these things, I think, very often are quite deliberately placed. And these hilltops, these holy hilltops, were perhaps used as processional walkways. You could see that they would have walked across the land to that tor. Another example, going back to Tregasil, this is the view from the stone circle, looking up towards Carnkenidjack. And we see these sites now as being rather static in the land, but they may not have been static when they were first built. People may well have walked the land. I'm sure lots of you are familiar with the Aboriginal in Australia, the usage of sites marked in the land as people walked from one site to another, and they would tell stories or sing songs about their ancestors or about some of the myths and stories associated with these sites. And if other Aboriginal people do this, my betting is that the people that built these sites also did it. They too would have walked the land. From Tregasil Stone Circle, they would have walked across the moors, telling stories, singing songs, telling the myths to do with the giants or whatever, or the ancestors that built these places like the Tor enclosure. These were processional routeways across the land. And there are some people, one of whom is here today, who are trying to recreate this and have in recent times walked the land at significant times from one end of West Penwith, from where the sun rose, to the other end of it, at Tregasil Circle, where the sun set into the sea over the Scillies. And walking the land in these kind of ways is a very powerful experience. It's bringing the land alive, it's bringing the sites alive. Our interactions with these places, they're not places that are just fixed in aspect. There are places that still live, still have energy, and to which we can still relate and interact. And walking the land is part of doing that. It's part of connecting to the spirit of these places. Another site in the land, which very much was used for these purposes, is the Nine Maidens stone circle at Boskedman. Two of the stones are larger than the rest of the circle, often called the portal stones, and they frame beautifully the holy hilltop of Carnkenidjack. Carngolba. And remember I said earlier that Carngolba has been thought to be one of these tor enclosures. So they were places that were originally enclosed by the Neolithic people. And by the time the Bronze Age people, early Bronze Age people, built the stone circles like the Nine Maidens, these places would have been very sacred places. Places that their ancestors built, and places that they could have visited by going on processional routeways across the land. Interestingly, quite recently, one of the archaeologists, Peter Herring, has suggested the very same thing, and he points out that the pathway across the land that goes through the Nine Maiden stone circle to Carngolba also goes through a number of barrows. The barrows were deliberately built on that pathway as they made their way in their sacred procession across the land. So, to me, this is a really exciting thing about our megalithic ancestors. We can begin to see the land through their eyes. We can begin to see the reasons why they might have built the sites where they built them. And as we walk the land, we are walking in their footsteps. It's maybe thousands of years later, but we are probably following the same paths that they walked when they walked across the land to honour their ancestors or honour their gods and goddesses. Okay, want to turn to the next subject now, which I mentioned in passing as we came along, that how many of these sites were actually built not only to link together sacred places in the land, but their view was also to the skies, because we know for certain that they could calculate and they could celebrate the changing sun and moon and sometimes star rises and sets at various points in the wheel of the year. They're just so much closer to the natural world than we are. We're shut away in our houses and we don't see a lot of the things that are going on in the sky unless we happen to be out by chance. And we know from all over the world that many of the ancient sites were deliberately aligned in order to see these sunrises and sunsets and moons, which I'll come on to in a minute. The most famous, which I'm sure many people have heard of, is Newgrange in Ireland. And this magnificent, very large burial chamber has a passage leading into it, and we've been there several times, but the time to really be there is the winter solstice sunrise, shortest day of the year, when the sun turns from winter into the coming spring. The days start to get longer and the nights start to get shorter. It was a key turning point for them, and they were able to observe this and calculate it and build their monument, incorporating a passage to show it, and that's the alignment coming in a light box over the entrance to it and shining down the passage, and it illuminates a recess at the end with a carved stone. So there are many, many examples of this from all over the world. I've talked quite a lot about this in the previous talk I gave last year, so I won't go over the same ground again. But once we started looking at Cornwall, although things are on a much smaller scale in Cornwall, we started to find there were other such alignments in Cornwall as well. This is Basiliac Barrow, which was excavated by Charles Thomas and rebuilt. It's on West End Moors up near Ding Dong Line. And the entrance to this barrow, which dates from about the same time as Newgrange in Ireland, this entrance is also oriented towards the midwinter solstice sunrise, and the first rays of the sun would have entered the entrance thus so and shone down the passage to the end. It's a mini version of Newgrange. It's on a much smaller scale, but nevertheless it's doing the same thing. And there are other examples from Cornwall that we've discovered of sites that have been deliberately aligned to solstices and equinoxes throughout the course of the wheel of the year. Not only, so some examples before I go on. And this is one of the most famous ones that have been discovered. This is, I'm sure as you all know, is Tune Coit. Now, sometimes we wonder why was the site built where it was built in the land? And I think very often there are reasons why it was built where it was built. In the case of Tune, some, 30 years ago now, I remember going up there on the winter solstice just to celebrate the solstice. And I was standing at this quoit, looking out over the horizon, and I saw the sun beginning to set over the horizon, and it was running along the top of the horizon towards Carn Kenidjack, that we've already looked at in relationship to the Silstone Circle. And as it ran across the top of the horizon, I thought to myself, it's heading for Carn Kenidjack. Now, Carn Kenidjack is quite distinctive. If you go up there and look across, you'll see it highlighted on the horizon. It's a fairly flat horizon, and then you've got Carn Kenidjack. It's known in folklore as the Hooting Carn. It's a natural rocky outcrop on the horizon. And as we know, Carn Kenidjack was probably a tor enclosure for the Neolithic people. So standing at Tune Coit, which would have been, the quoits would have been one of the earliest monuments to be built, possibly contemporary with the tor enclosures. Anybody standing there and watching the sunset would have seen it set into one of the two notches in Carn Kenidjack in the Neolithic times. Now the sun's, in looking at this, you have to remember that the sun has moved, or appeared to move slightly, as viewed from the Earth, in the 4,000 years or so since these monuments were built. But Carn Kenidjack has two notches, and originally would have set into one of them. It's now moved slightly at sun's width, and it sets into the other notch. But it makes a magnificent sight. And to stand there and see the sun, and you see it just about to set into Carn Kenidjack, is an absolutely magnificent sight. I have to say, we went there with the Earth Mysteries group every year for about 20 years. We never saw it. But towards the end, we did. And we know the climate would have been better at that time anyway, in the Neolithic, more like the south of France is now. It might well be in this country in the future. But to stand there and see that is a real piece of megalithic magic. You're standing in the same place that the ancients who built Tune Coit would have built it in order to capture that scene. If the court had been built some yards one way or some yards the other way, it just wouldn't have worked. It works in that particular spot. Now that's not to say it's the only reason Tune Coit was built. There may have been other reasons. We know there's a very strong energy line running from Tune Castle, which is nearby and dates about 1500 years later, that runs across to Tune Coit. And now, does that represent the processional path that people may have taken from the castle to the Coit? And is that energy line one that we douse because ancient peoples were walking it in a sacred way? and leaving a mark on the land that we can pick up today. All these are possibilities, but certainly one of the possibilities must have been that they wanted to capture the sun setting at the midwinter solstice sunset. We don't know exactly what the quoits were used for. They may have been partially enclosed, at least up until the top capstone. But what we suspect is that they were places that had sacred significance. The people who lived in the valleys below and built these quoits on the hilltops and would go to these places at significant times. Perhaps they would be visited by the spirit person of the tribe, the shaman or shamanka. Perhaps they were places where the dead were placed on the top of the capstone for excarnation, the picking of the flesh by the carrion birds, and then the bones placed inside the quoit. And the shamans or the shamankas may well have gone to these places to go on a spirit journey in order to connect with the spirits of the people who were buried there. We know from other people living indigenous or Stone Age lifestyles that very often the shamans will go on spirit journeys to meet with the spirits of the dead, to ask some very practical questions about the tribe and living in the tribe, such as what to do about cattle that were ill or people who were sick. So these may have had a very practical purpose in visiting these places. And of course the midwinter solstice sunset would be the very point of time before they knew that the seasons were about to change, life was about to return, warmer days were about to come. So it's about the continuity of life and the continuity of living within the tribe. So these were sacred places, and that's emphasised, I think, by this midwinter solstice sunset. Interestingly, some strange phenomena have been noticed at places like this. The archaeologist John Barnett and a colleague of his were up here, Brian Markman, up here doing some survey work. They were going to spend the night there. And they took it in turns to go inside the little chamber underneath the quoit. And there, much to their amazement, they noticed a lot of little lights running across the underside of the quoit. There was no indication of what they could be. The lights were coloured. They weren't reflections of car lights or anything. This is too far from the road. There was nothing that they could explain it by. But they observed it and recorded it. And again, we were talking earlier about energy. Was this a manifestation of energy within the quoit in some way that manifested as light and these little lights? I mean, you can trust them as observers, they're archaeologists, and they had no explanation for it, which always pleases me when archaeologists can't find an explanation for things. But the lights were very real, they were recorded, they were little small. So was this a place, is this a place of energy which manifests as light? And were the ancients aware of that, and that's why they built this place? Or was it a byproduct of building it and using it for sacred purposes? Does it create energy, and is that energy under some circumstances, sometimes still visible? So lots of questions, but interesting ideas. Another possible alignment place. We talked earlier about that gatepost stone, remember? Which pointed to Trendreen Hill. Well, if you go up to Trendreen Hill and you're walking, you approach a chamber cairn, an entrance grave, the remains of it, on as you come up to it, all you can see is the remains of the entrance grave. But when you finally get to the top, and as you just come over the ridge, laid out before you is this, which is Trevalgan Hill, seen from the entrance grave on the top of Trendreen. Now it's a beautiful shaped hill, a breast-shaped hill really. Its colloquial name is known as Buttermilk Hill, and I often wonder whether that's a memory of its fertility aspect, because it really stands out in the landscape. And interestingly, if you stand at Trendreen, the midsummer solstice sun will rise over Trevalgan Hill, over Buttermilk Hill. So it's things like this when you're out in the land that I always think are really interesting to look for. What is there to be seen from the site where you're standing? And would that have been significant at particular times of the year? It's not only the sun that was viewed from some of these sites, also the moon. The moon is harder to spot, to plot, because although the sun forms a 12-month solar cycle, the moon forms a 28-year lunar cycle, and it only returns to the same spot in the sky at the standstill. Sorry, not 28, 18.6 years. And therefore, when we look at the moon, it's going to be rising in a slightly different place, slightly different angle. It takes 9.3 years to rise to its highest point, which is the minor standstill, and another 9.3 years to move back to the major lunar standstill. These standstills we think were of interest to ancient peoples. They knew about them, they could spot them. There's a whole lot of stone circles in Aberdeenshire, which are recumbent stone circles that have two uprights and a horizontal standing stone between, and that seems to be a kind of frame for some of the lunar movements on the standstill cycle, risings and settings. We have a keen archaeoastronomers like Carolyn, who's sitting in the front here, who are going to be out looking for the next standstill, which is imminent. It's soon upon us. The last one, I'll mention in a moment, Carol, who was here, set up an experiment at the Menontoll to see whether the standstill would work or not, and found that it did. I know Carolyn's going to be out looking at some of the sites. It's due to happen in 2025, so it's quite soon that we're going to see it. So these lunar standstills, we know were important to the people. This is the entrance grave on Chapel Bray, and this was at a previous lunar standstill where I crawled into the entrance bit. I'm not sure I can do that now, but I crawled into the entrance bit and saw the moon rise, framed by the entrance to the entrance grave on Chapel Bray. So 2025 or 2024, end of 24 into 25, it's going to be really interesting to be looking and seeing if we can find any of these lunar standstill phenomena. One that was suggested, I'll just show you the moon, which was visible through the entrance to Chapel Bray. One of these that was suggested for the standstill was at the Menontoll. Now, everybody knows the Menontoll. I think most people nowadays know that it was originally part of a stone circle, possibly 19 stones, and you can see where the beginning of the circle curves round with the other stones. The whole stone is unique in terms of stone circles. We don't know of any other stone circle where a whole stone is part of the stone circle. But the Cornwall Archaeological Unit, who surveyed the site, sometimes they're quite innovative in their thinking, suggested that the whole stone may originally have been in the centre of the stone circle at right angles to where it is now. And if that were the case, then the lunar standstill would have been framed beautifully by the moon, full moon rising and being seen through the whole stone. Oops, come back to that one. And as I mentioned, Carol did a cutout of the whole stone and tested it out at the last standstill to see whether the moon, which rises very low at the lunar standstill, skims just the top of the hills in the background there, could have shone directly through the whole stone at the standstill, and she found that indeed it could have done. So I think these things are really interesting. They get more complicated with the lunar movements, but it's going to be fascinating to see if there are sites that we can identify that the ancient peoples themselves would have identified and observed and honoured the moon. Because I think for these people it was probably part of their belief system, their faith system. They may have viewed not only the earth as the earth mother, but the whole universe as being part of the goddess, and both the sun and the moon would possibly have been a god or goddess that they would have honoured and celebrated. So we're not just looking at the astronomy of all of this, we're looking at the spirituality of all of this as well. Another final interesting one is this one, and this, of course, as you all know, will be the Merry Maidens. And it was Norman Lockyer again who suggested that something quite interesting with the star system may be going on here. Now, lots of people visit the Merry Maidens. It's very accessible. Not everybody knows that standing in the Merry Maidens and looking in the field at the opposite side from the Merry Maidens is a standing stone in the hedge, and this is the Goon Reef men here. It fell down a few years ago, but the archaeological unit put it back up again. And the hedge was obviously a later addition, and it was built to run through the standing stone. Now, Lockyer suggested that if you stand at this standing stone, if you did stand at this standing stone at Goon Reef, and look towards the Merry Maidens, and that's the view from Goon Reef, looking towards the Merry Maidens, and this is coming in a bit closer up. People standing there at the time the circle was built, at the end of what is now April, would have seen the rising of the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, over the Merry Maidens. And if you remember back in Cheryl, we saw that they would have seen the rising of the Pleiades over Boswell's land here. The same thing could be seen here. And of course, the end of April, when the Pleiades rises over the Merry Maidens, is a very significant time in the wheel of the year, because it marks the coming of Beltane, of the May Day festival. So for the megalithic peoples to have been there at that time, to seen the return of the Pleiades after the winter season, would tell them that the time of plenty and fecundity was upon them, and it was time to celebrate the Beltane festival. And I always think it's magical, in the land, standing there and seeing things like this, and knowing that the ancient peoples would have been aware. To them it wasn't just the sites, it was the relationship of the sites to what was going on in the heavens. and how they were all linked together. Right, we're into the final canter through these megalithic mysteries. And I want to turn now to the sites themselves and some of the possible anomalous phenomena that may have been experienced at the sites, and we can find it today. This was all kick-started by Paul Devereaux back in the 80s when he came up with the idea of the Dragon Project. And the Dragon Project's purpose was to go to different sites and check on interesting phenomena that have been experienced or reported at these sites. This is Tregipian Barrow, which is just up the road from the Merry Maidens. It's got this very distinctive cut-mark stone standing outside the barrow, which was originally actually facing into the barrow, so it wasn't for public consumption, it was for the dead who were buried in the barrow to view. And it's been calculated, Ian Cook calculated, that there are 13 cut marks and 12 oval shapes in this stone. This one's actually a replica, the original is in the Royal Cornwall Museum in Truro. And Ian reckoned that this was really significant to them. It wasn't just a random number of cut marks that they built there, because in any one solar year there are going to be 12 new moons and 13 full moons, or 12 full moons and 13 new moons. And here on the stone we've got 13 and 12 carved. So perhaps this is an encoded language, a language that they would have all understood, and furthermore it's not a language for the living, it's a language for the dead, for the spirits of the dead buried inside the Tregipian Barrow. Perhaps it was to aid them on their journey to the afterlife. And perhaps that afterlife was to be found in the Pleiades, which was viewed rising over the nearby Merry Maidens circle. Perhaps all these things are interconnected and are about not only the movement of the planets and the stars and the sun, but are about their belief system and their spiritual beliefs, and in particular what happens to their spirits after they die. Now the interesting thing that we did some of this Dragon project work down here in Cornwall, and one of the strands of the Dragon project was to look at the radiation at these ancient sites, particularly important down here in Cornwall because of course of the granitic rock upon which the site sit. And we know that there's a high radiation down here. We know that because of radioactive decay, radon gas is emitted, and certainly some years ago there was quite a worry that we might all be consuming far too much radon gas for our own benefit. And there were tests done on new house builds to see how much radon gas was being emitted. So we know there's a lot of radiation and natural radioactive decay in the environment. And part of the Dragon project was to look at this and see whether there was any kind of correlation between the sites that were built and the ensuing radiation. One of the sites we looked at was Tregipian Barrow, this one, and we found that in the enclosed area of the entrance grave there was indeed a very high radiation count. It was 210% higher than background radiation. Now that alerted us to the fact that there was something going on with these sites. Now radioactive particle emissions, you can't see them, you can't smell them, you can't touch them, you can't feel them. You don't know that they're there, they can only be picked up with a Geiger counter. So the counter argument goes, well, is this coincidence? The ancient peoples would not have been aware of it. But it just makes me wonder, because I think that the ancient peoples were so, the megalithic peoples were so much in touch with the land and the earth. They were so much more sensitive than we are. We're surrounded by electromagnetic forces and mobile phones and radio and TV and all of that. They weren't. And they may well have been much more sensitive and able to experience at least the effects of things, if not the causes of them. So it's possible that they were aware of high radiation. We looked at several stone circles. Going back to the Merry Maidens, we did, this was tested 4 times, I did one of them. We started with Geiger counters and checked the background radiation, and that was high, but that was standard. It was pretty well the same everywhere. We moved towards the circle to a number of places, and at the circle itself we checked the stones. They were high. They were often higher than the background. Again, to be expected. The stones had been hewed out of the land and therefore were very highly radioactive. We then moved in towards the centre of the circle, and something very strange happened. Something totally unexpected, and I don't even know to this day the cause of it. But it was checked 4 times, and every time the same thing was found. The Geiger counter was clicking away madly, picking up the radiation from the stones in the stone circle. We got to the centre of the circle, and whoosh, it dropped out completely. No reaction, no radiation. And that was amazing. There was no reason that we could think of for it, but it seemed that the centre of these circles, and we checked them all, and got similar readings at Treckerseal, less so at Boscanoon, though there was something else happening at Boscanoon, I'll mention in a minute. And then they all seemed to be a kind of sanctuary in the middle of the circle where there was no radiation being emitted. Now, were the ancients that built these sites aware of this? Were these centres of the circles some kind of place where there was sanctity, where they could perform their rituals and their rites? Was there an awareness that while outside everything must have been buzzing, that inside the circles there was peace and purity, if you like, where there was nothing happening? It seems an odd coincidence that it should be the case, and they weren't aware of this. I mean, it may just be a coincidence, but it's still rather strange. The slide shows the work that we were doing at the time when we were measuring this radiation. And other things were discovered. I mentioned at Boscanoon, the interesting thing there was the stones themselves were very highly radioactive, of course, with one exception. I'll leave you to guess which one, but there is in the Boscanoon stone circle a quartz stone, which is often thought of being a really sacred, a healing stone. People use it for that. Sometimes it's called the mother stone of the circle. And there the radiation was very low. All the rest of the stones, all the other 18 stones and the centre stone, very high radiation. Quartz stone, very low. Did people know that? I mean, they may not have had words for radiation or radioactivity, but were they aware of things like this? Could they tell? Is this why that quartz stone became known for its healing powers? I mean, quartz has very interesting properties in itself. It has a lattice work. I mean, we think of stones as inanimate objects, but perhaps they didn't. Perhaps they were living objects to them. Perhaps because of all the electrons and neutrons and protons buzzing around, in the lattice work. But these stones, they're very, perhaps they're energetic, and perhaps they thought of them as being energetic and living. Perhaps stones represented their ancestors in some kind of way. But is the fact that the quartz stone at Boscanoon become known as a healing stone to do with that? To do with that very low radiation? These things are speculation. We're into the realm of speculation now. They're very interesting questions, I think, even if we don't have all the answers. Going back to the Menental, the radiation there was checked, and inside the whole stone it was found to be double the background. So when you go up there and follow the old tradition of crawling through the stone 9 times, traditions, for healing, bear in mind you're getting a hefty dose of radiation. But is that necessarily a bad thing? Now, I mean, in medicine we use radiation, we use it for radiotherapy. Short, sharp bursts of radiation can be a healing thing in some present-day medical circles. Did they know this? Did they know that by going through the whole stone they would get healing for back? I mean, the legend is that it cures crick or backache. Is this a very old tradition that goes back to the time it was built? And did they go through that whole stone in order to get that kind of healing? We can never be certain. But it's interesting when we start to measure these things, and we find that they've got these kind of anomalies that we need to ask these questions. The other sites that were looked at also had very anomalous radioactivity qualities. Not only sites like the stone circles, but the holy wells were looked at as well. And for instance, St. Creed well, which goes deep down inside the earth, had a very high radiation. The radiation at St. Creed was 200% higher than background. It's interesting, Paul Devereaux observed, he was with a group of people at St. Creed well, and he said the prime energy effect of this place is the sense of calm it engenders, peace, repose. I've actually seen every person in a group of 15 people enter a deep, languid state here, or completely fall asleep. It is a place to sleep, to have the dream of earth. Did our ancestors know this? Did they go to these places, experience the same thing, go on into altered states of consciousness, go on spirit journeys at places like this? Because there was an interaction between the energies of the place and the human brain. I mean, the hippocampus in the human brain is very susceptible to influences. Could the energies of these places interact with the hippocampus in our brain and cause these altered states of consciousness, or this languid sleep? It's very interesting. I could go on a lot about the energies at places like this, but we're getting near the end, and I want to mention one or two other anomalous things that were found as part of this Straffon project. We talked earlier about the blind fiddler standing stone and its alignment with the Markstone and St. Creed beacon. Other interesting things have also been observed at the blind fiddler. And there's something called the earth sound, which was experienced at this place by somebody. And he described it thus: we entered the field to find ourselves alone, but for the long-eared crop whispering in the slight breeze. Touching the men here, we looked west to see the sun edging along the hills, steadily losing height. We noticed a clearly visible notch in one hill, and from where we stood, it almost seemed that this notch have been created to drain the last drops of sunlight into the earth at midsummer. Moments later, the mist began to return, but not before the answer came. The sun obligingly slipped into the notch on the western hill and disappeared from view. There was a momentary stillness, and then came the earth thunder. It was like a sudden, muffled thunderclap, audible, but emanating from beneath the earth. It did not shake the ground, but seemed to alter the air pressure, the way explosions do. We are convinced that the sound emanated from within the earth, as if a charge was triggered, perhaps by certain alignments between the earth and her sister spheres. Could the stones act to amplify these signals? We're now into the realm of infrared and infrared sound and ultrasound. Sounds that are above the level of human hearing and below the level of human hearing. And it's interesting that a number of sites have been identified as being associated with these sounds. The range of human hearing at the upper limit is about 20 kilohertz, and at the lower level is about 20 hertz. Anything above 20 kilohertz and anything under 20 hertz we won't hear with our natural ears. However, our bodies may be aware of them, and there's been evidence in some places where people are exposed to infra noise below 20 hertz, that they have really bad reactions through their bodies. They get pains, they get headaches, and all sorts of things. You can't hear the noise, but it's still there. And that leads us quite nicely into the humidras. Now, the humidras is a well-attested phenomena. There's been quite a lot in the national and local press about the humidras. Humidras is a Cornish word. It was coined in the 19th century, and it describes a very low resonant sound that can either not be heard through the ears or only heard at very, very low frequencies. And the humidras has been recorded in experience at a number of sites. And interestingly, the one site where it's been most recorded is Zencoit. And this is a photo of the Cornish Earth Mysteries group visit to Zencoit on the day that the humidras was heard there. I heard the humidras once in company of a couple of other people, and it's like a low sound that seems to emanate from the earth. It's like the earth is speaking in a very, very low voice. And it's quite an extraordinary thing. I've only ever heard it once, and I heard it at Zencoit as well. But this is an account by Andy Norfolk that was there on the day. He says, "It was a glorious sunny day with a cloudless sky and no wind. We walked up to the quoit, and when we got there it was quite quiet with no noise, except a lot of chatter. Most of us walked on to Sperris Quoit, and then, in the top of Trendreen Hill, where there is a trig point, Carol, who stayed on her own at Zencoit, heard a loud humming or buzzing noise, as if there were large numbers of bees or other insects flying around, but there were hardly any to be seen. Diane, who had walked to Trendreen Hill, was very aware of all this noise. All the time we were on top of the downs. There was a few light aircraft flying nearby at various times, but very little traffic noise. Although there were a few insects, they were noticeable as they flew by, as distinct from the background noise. Deanne and I walked back to collect Carol from Zencoit, and all three of us heard the same noise very clearly. It was quite different from the aircraft noises. Carol and I had kept bees in the past, and the noise was very like a contented hive, but there were no bees nearby. The noise was all around, and it was impossible to locate the source. There seemed to be no difference between the noise in badly burnt areas and those where the heather was in flower. As we walked down over the top of the downs the noise faded away, disappearing as we got below approximately the 200-metre contour, to be replaced by the more usual noise of crickets and other insects, quite different. And this noise has been heard in other places, but interesting, most notably here. I'm going right back to the beginning of this talk. There's an energy line that runs directly across the top and goes through from Trendreen Hill, where we saw the possible sunrise over Trafalgar, runs across the top through Sperris Settlement and through Zennacoit and onto other further sites as well, first identified by John Michel. Is the energy very, very strong here? Does it occasionally, under the right conditions, manifest as homodras? Interesting. If anybody else has heard it, let me know afterwards, because I think it's a fascinating topic. As well as some infra sounds like that, some places have shown light phenomena. We go back to the Merry Maidens, and here some very interesting light and sound phenomena were experienced. And I'll just quote this one from Rob Lunston. He was at the circle at midnight with a friend on a starlit night with no moon. Between them they had 3 cameras. On one camera he had taken 3 photos with inbuilt flash on the way to the circle, and it had worked perfectly. Outside the circle itself the flash also worked okay, but subsequently it was revealed that no photographs taken there came out. However, it was inside the circle that strange things really began to happen. No flashes on any of the cameras would work, and subsequently, when the films were developed, there were no pictures except on one, which, despite the lack of flash, showed pictures of a rod illuminated from the feet up with a brilliant white light. Also in the photograph were revealed anomalous balls of light floating around in front of the stones. These balls of light have appeared on other photographs taken by other people at other ancient sites as well, though at the time they were not visible to the naked eye. He also goes on to say that during that time, during that encounter, they all heard voices, noises. There was nobody else in the circle. It sounded like it was a foreign language. You couldn't distinguish any words or anything, but it felt like, it seems like he had an encounter with the other world. And we're now getting into fairly deep areas, which I don't have time to go into on this talk. But a lot of these sites seem to be portals into another dimension at certain times. I'll just leave it to there for the moment. But some people have experienced these phenomena in many other different kinds of ways. This is Ballet Fugu. And Fugu seem to be strange places, anomalous places. Most people, including archaeologists, think they were places of ritual and ceremony. And the radiation in these Fugus is very high. Ballet Fugu, when we checked that one out, it was double the background. And interesting things have been experienced in the Fugu. For instance, strange lights, strange energy. Joe May, who lived in the house next to the Fugu, recorded some of them. He said, just at the point of dawn, as light was beginning to break, I saw thin sporadic filaments swirling in front of my eyes and around the main capping lintels of the passage. At first I thought it was a retinal image, much like floaters or dead cells on the eyeball, but I'd never experienced such spiralic phenomena before, and they seemed to be moving independently of my eye movements. They most closely resembled the whorls on fingertips, but lots of them, interlaced and moving gently. Then I saw hundreds of tiny pricks of light, like stars, again moving gently, with the occasional streak as if some of them were shooting stars. I checked that this was not some kind of subjective or self-produced effect by switching my gaze back to the emerging light at the entrance of the fugu, and then redirecting my gaze several points within the passage. The stars returned unmistakably. The whole passage appeared to be filled with what can best be described as a star soup, which flowed in and around the stones. Somehow I knew that what I was seeing was energy, which, though subtle, was clearly there. I suspect that the ability to see it depends on certain fine-tuning of perception, which is probably available to everyone. And a bit later on, he talks about another experiences that he's had in the fugu. He says, the only sounds in the fugu are your breathing and heartbeat, and then the voices come. You want to cling to reality and block the voices out, but they are insistent, and you listen because although you hear them with your mind, they speak with a voice that is not your own. And locked in here for centuries, they want to be heard. The kind of phenomena experienced in the fugu on several occasions by a number of people simultaneously include inner voices giving uncannily pertinent guidance, sometimes forecasting events before they happen, subjective perceptions of powers and presences, usually of female figures, frequently described as women in white or priestesses, visions involving fire, symbolic perhaps of inner cleansing, visions involving the laying out of the dead, usually bedecked with flowers, in preparation for the soul's journey to another realm. Visions of enforced entombment for the purpose of confronting the dark side of the soul in order to re-emerge reborn. Experiences of people being called to the fugu to symbolically die or else to collectively grieve someone who actually has died. Experiences of waves, of peace, of comfort, the stilling of inner turmoil. These are some powerful places. The last one I want to look at is Carnuni Fugu, up on the Romano-Celtic village, and experiences phenomena have been discovered at this place as well. A particular case in mind was a woman who contacted me who said that she'd had some kind of time slip experience in the fugu. She said, my fiancé and I enjoyed a wonderful holiday in St Just. We chose Cornwall to explore umpteen Celtic or pagan sites, but went to the areas open-minded, not with preconceived ideas. One hot day we visited Carnuni Fugu. After having explored it, my boyfriend decided to cool off in the fugu itself. I myself couldn't go in. It wasn't an unpleasant feeling, I just knew I shouldn't go in at that particular time. So instead I propped against what I took to be a windowsill and started to sketch the entrance. Immediately I knew I was being watched from behind. I didn't turn round, carried on drawing, and let what would happen happen. How I knew what I felt, I don't know. But I know the mother of the house had been preparing some food and came to the window to see who was there. She had with her her little girl, who asked the mother what I was doing. The mother then picked her up so she could see. I dared not turn round for fear of losing contact. On completion, I called my boyfriend, who was ready to leave. He felt nothing or saw nothing. But again, as we left the village, I had a pleasant feeling of saying goodbye to a friendly community. And many people have reported to me that they find this site incredibly peaceful, a real sense of the community of people who live there. So did she, when she was sketching, because sketching is an artistic process that you do in some kind of altered state of consciousness, did she have a time slip when she saw the inhabitants of the village as it was originally? Was it something to do with the energy at this site that she tapped into, that led her into this time slip experience? Fascinating questions. And the more I live here, the more I walk the sites here, the more I talk to people here, the more experiences are told to me about these places. This truly is a place of megalithic mysteries. I'll finish with the setting sun through the Fugu entrance at Boscasma, which is near where we live. Thank you all for coming. There's lots more of this kind of stuff if you're interested in the Megalithic Mysteries of Cornwall book. And leave you with the thought that if you're out in the land, you spot some things, let me know.